Yeah, we live just outside Dallas, and I think it's about 103, 104 right now. So, and it's even at night, it's not getting down below about 90, 91.
Wow. And any rain at all, or is it still very dry?
Oh no, rain's about as rare as a UFO right now.
Well, there you go. Is it rare with UFO sightings down in
well,
Texas?
well, actually, I think probably UFO sightings aren't as rare as rain right now. So,
Have you ever, Nick, been to the Marfa area? Look at the Marfa lights in Texas?
I actually haven't, but there's a lot of people don't realize there's a lot of areas around Texas that have sightings of these ghostly lights, like the Marfa lights, and I've investigated a number of them, but Marfa's quite a long way south of here, but it's on the list, put it that way. So.
Yep, absolutely. Are you familiar with any bases a la S4 Area 51 style down there?
Well, there's a lot of military bases. Fort Hood, for example, is a military base in Texas, which has had a number of ties to the UFO subject, where people have come forward talking about sort of like classified UFO research undertaken from the base. And back in the late 1970s, a UFO researcher named Leonard Stringfield published a lot of material about UFO activity involving the military at Fort Hood. So there's quite a bit of stuff, going on along those lines in Texas as well.
Absolutely. I recall there was a very interesting, I mean, it wasn't really a sighting of sorts, but it was some kind of weird light phenomena in Fort Worth in Texas. I don't know if you recall that. It was from May earlier this year, Nick.
I don't recall that one offhand, but there have been a lot of reports over the course of about the last year or so that I can think of, probably 20 or 30 reports that I've received of just weird things in the sky, that don't necessarily fit the image of like a classic UFO or flying saucer, but just weird aerial phenomena, strange flashes of lights, like explosion type noises in the sky, that actually sound like they are coming from the sky rather than the ground. So, Texas is kind of a weird state where we get a lot of strange UFO activity going on.
Absolutely, and of course we're here primarily today, Nick, to talk about strange things on the surface of the Earth, about your book, The Real Men in Black, a really interesting subject that I don't think we've specifically, directly talked with anybody about before. So this is going to be really exciting. Maybe you can just set the tone a little bit for us, Nick, and just tell us about the outline of the book, if you will, the main theme that you're running through.
Yeah, sure. Well, basically, I'm sure most people who, when they think of the Men in Black, they naturally think of the Hollywood movies starring Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones. And the movies, they're interesting, fun-packed adventures, but a lot of people don't realize that the movies were based on a comic book series of the same name, which were inspired by real-life encounters with Men in Black style characters. Now, as I said, a lot of people just assume that they're creations of Hollywood. So one of the things I wanted to do was to set the record straight and demonstrate to people that the Men in Black phenomenon is a very real one. And also, a lot of people, even within the UFO research community, thought that the Men in Black mystery was a very old one, from the 1940s through the 60s, and then it had kind of vanished or gone away. But the reality is I've been able to find reports right up until the present day, literally like 2009, 2010. So that was the other reason to write the book, was to demonstrate this is very much an ongoing mystery. And so the fact that I've been able to uncover a lot of new cases as well was one of the reasons why I felt that the time was sort of right to put out a new full-length study of the Men in Black mystery.
Absolutely. I think there is two men that seems to be kind of at the root of the phenomena, at least in the beginning of describing it and making it kind of known, I guess. Albert K. Bender and Gray Barker. Talk a little bit about that, Nick.
Yeah, sure. Well, Albert Bender was probably the one person more than anybody else who was responsible for kicking off, if you like, and beginning the Men in Black mystery. Now, Bender grew up in a place called Bridgeport in Connecticut, USA. And even back to his teens, he had an interest in paranormal phenomena and sort of horror phenomena. both in the world of fiction and fact. He actually developed a big interest in things like the Bermuda Triangle and UFOs in the post-World War era, in the post-Second World War era. But he was also very interested in the writings of people like H.P. Lovecraft and Edgar Allan Poe. So he was someone who, sort of straddled fiction and fact when it came to having an interest in paranormal phenomena. And in 1952, Bender set up an organization called the International Flying Saucer Bureau. And the idea was to basically put a group together in the United States which would have a network of contacts. And the group actually took off far bigger, I think, than and on a much larger scale than Bender probably anticipated. And chapters of the group were set up in England and Australia and elsewhere, and it really became a large-scale organization. And this was made all the more mysterious by the fact that barely a year after Bender established the group, when it was doing really well and it was very successful, he closed the group down. He completely shut it down without warning and alluded to two of his friends, that he'd been visited by three men in black. And they'd essentially told him if he knew what was good for him and he wanted to stay healthy and alive, he would leave the UFO subject and walk away, which is exactly what he did. And this really sort of gave birth to the Men in Black mystery and the legend. And from there what happened is that Gray Barker, who was a friend of Albert Bender and also a fellow UFO researcher, who was a very good author also, a very sort of imaginative author who could, he could tell a non-fiction story, but he had a very imaginative way of doing it. And he related Bender's experiences in a 1956 book called They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers. And this reinforced the scenario of the Men in Black going around, very often in groups of three, and silencing people. So really between the two of them, Bender and Barker were the two guys who really kind of kicked off the entire Men in Black mystery.
Absolutely, it's very interesting their story and the connection and things that have happened since that time, obviously. But why don't we talk a little bit about, I guess, run through some of the theories about what or who they are. There is, as far as I understand it as well, Nick, references to the fact that these beings, people, what have you, have been around further back into history as well. I remember actually listening to a presentation by John Keel who brought up some attention to this topic as well, about them being connected with the Sami people of the north, or the Laplanders. Have you heard about that, Nick?
Yes, I have. I mean, one of the interesting things about the Men in Black is that they don't seem to have just one point of origin. There seems to be several possibilities for who the Men in Black might actually be. Now, there's absolutely no doubt in my mind at all that some Men in Black can be explained as people working for the government. There's no doubt about that, because we have some files which have surfaced through the Freedom of Information Act, both in the US and the UK, which do talk about how people have had strange visits. They talked about them in the past, and then years later, the official files have surfaced. So there's no doubt that there is a government angle, which is kind of similar to that portrayed in the Men in Black movies. But as well as that angle, there's another side to the Men in Black, where many of the Men in Black actually look and sound and act very, very weird. They're often described as being perhaps only sort of 5 feet to 5.5 feet tall, very pale skinned, almost looking like anorexic or anemic. And they don't seem conversant with our mannerisms. They very often have widely set eyes or bulging eyes, and they look strange. And this has led to a number of theories being put forward for this second category of Men in Black. Everything from, are they aliens? Could they be some sort of ancient human race? Are they paranormal? Are they time travelers? These are the sort of the main theories that are being put forward that goes beyond the straightforward government angle, if you like.
And is there any of those at this point that you favor? Is there any evidence that seems to suggest one over the other?
Well, I mean, as I said, there's no doubt in my mind that there's a government aspect to it. Now, when it comes to the weirder Men in Black, however we define what the paranormal might be, I think they fall in this second category of Men in Black, fall into that particular area, the paranormal. But exactly what the paranormal is, and that's the big question.
Right.
Does it mean they're supernatural? Do they come from another dimension, another time? I mean, it's difficult to say, but when you see the reports and you speak to the witnesses, it's very, very clear that, they go far, far beyond, just the idea that they work for the FBI or the CIA or something along those lines. So.
Do you know, Nick, if there's been any footage or photos taken of one or several?
Yeah, I've actually got a couple of photographs reproduced in the book, both of which, interestingly enough, date from the 1960s. And one of the photographs was taken by a man named Timothy Green Beckley. And Tim is still involved in the UFO scene today. And what happened was, the story goes back to 1968, and there was a husband and wife team of UFO investigators living in Jersey City in the USA, named Jack and Mary Robinson. And Jack was heavily into UFOs, and Mary was more into paranormal and supernatural phenomena. And in 1968, they were investigating a number of significant UFO cases in Jersey City and the surrounding areas. And on one occasion, they went out for dinner one evening. When they got back home, it looked like somebody had been going through Jack's files, through his filing cabinets, as if somebody had broken into the house. And this coincided with when Jack would go to work in the morning. Mary started seeing this strange, sinister-looking man in black standing in the doorway of a building opposite the apartment in which they lived. And the guy kind of really unsettled and unnerved Mary, because she said he had this sort of long black trench coat, black sunglasses, black hat, and was just sort of staring enigmatically right up at the window of their apartment. And he was there every single morning for the best part of a week. And Mary told Jack about this, and he became concerned as well. It was as if someone was spying on the apartment and spying on the Robinsons. And so what Mary did, she knew that Tim Beckley, the researcher I mentioned, she knew that Tim had investigated Men in Black cases. So she telephoned Tim, who in turn phoned another colleague named Jim Mosley, who's also still on the UFO scene today. And they quickly headed out the following morning to see if this man was still there. And sure enough, there he was, stood in the doorway. And so Tim quickly snapped a photograph of this guy, and I reproduced this one in the book. And he looks kind of weird and enigmatic. He literally is just standing in the recess of the doorway,
yeah,
staring outwards with kind of like a blank zombie-like expression on his face. Now, this is just one of two pictures of the Men in Black we have on record, at least. I reproduced another in the book from 1969, where a man named Alan Greenfield photographed a man in black who he said kind of quite literally vanished into thin air when he rounded a corner when Alan tried to pursue him and chase him. So, we have a number of photographs which are interesting and kind of enigmatic. And also, they offer some sort of verification of the fact that when people have reported these things, we're able to demonstrate that they really did see them, because in several cases we do now have photographs.
That's very interesting, and I want to obviously talk more about the behavior overall. There are some very, very strange accounts of these, and the question, of course, is if this should be attributed to what you call at this point either the real Dan or the other Men in Black, those who have the weird elements and aspect to them. But let's talk a little bit about their behavior, because obviously, Nick, that they show up in not always, but in many regards in or around a sighting or close to it in proximity of time-wise. Is it usually to try to warn people not to talk about what they've seen, right? That's the customary thing that I'm familiar with when it comes to Men in Black.
Yes, that certainly is the case. Typically what happens is that someone will have what is usually, but not always, usually a fairly profound and significant UFO experience. And, perhaps they're driving home late at night and they have missing time, or they have an abduction experience. So it's usually cases like that that attract the attention of the Men in Black, where something important has happened. And very often the approach of the Men in Black is extremely similar in most of the cases we have on record. For example, they often turn up late at night and in groups of 3. And it's almost as if the Men in Black know that the incident has occurred, even if the witness hasn't reported it to anyone, and which is another odd aspect of the phenomenon. But as I said, they often turn up late at night, and they'll bang on the front door. And one of the strangest things is, it's almost as if when the people open the door, it's as if their self-will and their common sense just melts away, as if the Men in Black have somehow exerted some type of, like, a hypnotic control over them, to where the witnesses just let these guys into the house and, invite them to sit down, don't ask for any identification, and basically just, tell them all about their experience. And, of course, if somebody was to knock on your front door at 11 o'clock at night, standing there in a black suit, tie, sunglasses and hat, you probably wouldn't let them into the house.
I wouldn't open even, but...
No. Or at the very least, you would ask for some sort of identification.
Right.
But with the Men in Black, it's almost as if, as I said, as if they're placed under some sort of hypnotic control to where they just don't ask these sorts of questions. And when the interrogation is over, very often the Men in Black will make a kind of a veiled threat that it would be a good idea not to talk about this. And then they just leave as mysteriously as they arrived and then just vanish into the night, which again is sort of very, very strange and kind of ominous. But it's something that's been reported literally from all around the world, this particular aspect of the MIB and how they behave. So that is sort of the typical scenario that we have. And as I point out in the book, it seems to have parallels. We can go back hundreds of years into things like vampire accounts and see a lot of parallels with sort of black-suited Men in Black today and black-cloaked vampires from, the 17th and 18th centuries and things like that.
Yeah, it's a very interesting story. And if we talk about the aspect that is brought up in the movie, then the fictional movie, they have a device. Obviously, they have a form of technology to decapacitate the people that they are influencing, if you will. They have a memory control, almost a time control as well. Do you think that there could be any truth to that they might actually have a set of technologies, advanced technologies that we don't know about or have access to?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's possible. I mean, I have to be honest, I've never come across evidence actually of technology being used, but certainly the big thing that the real life Men in Black have with the Hollywood equivalents is that they do exert deep control over the person they're interviewing. Now, of course, in the movies with Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones, they have this device that makes the person forget the incident, and then they feed them a false memory of what occurred. That they saw Venus or they saw, a meteorite or something like that. Now, we don't quite get that in the real cases, but as I said, we do have the Men in Black exerting a lot of control over the witness, and they very do often try and tell them that the sighting had a mundane explanation and they shouldn't worry about it. So, in that respect, there are a lot of deep similarities, as to how and why they seem to be able to manipulate people.
Is there evidence that seems to suggest that when it comes to warning about, not talking about the sighting, that those could be possibly attributed to the CIA/FBI version of the Men in Black?
Yes. Yeah, I think this is why, I think you're quite right, and I think this is why the subject is so complex and difficult to resolve, because we have different categories of Men in Black. And I think certainly some of these cases where a specific threat is made, and they seem far more human than some of the other ones, I'm pretty sure that these are government cases. Now, what's kind of ironic is that I think in some cases the military may actually mimic the weirder Men in Black as a means to cover their tracks. If somebody talks about seeing a weird man in black, most people probably wouldn't believe it. So I think the Men in Black mythology, or the weird aspects, actually serves the government well if they can kind of exploit it and use it to their own ends as well.
Absolutely. I want to read a passage here from an article very interesting about this, and that this has to do with Keel's work and a little bit about Jacques Vallée's work as well. And it goes like this. Keel tells of a tall man with the pointed features and thyroid eyes wearing an ill-fitting and out-of-fashion black suit sat in a booth at New York City restaurant in the summer of 1967 and said that he wanted something to eat, but could not be more specific than food. The waitress brought a steak, which he stared at for a long while, then picked up his knife and fork and observed the other patrons. He did not know how to use the utensils. The waitress watched him fumble for a while and then showed him how to cut the steak and spear it with his fork. She asked him where he was from. He answered, "Another world." This article said, hardly the actions and words of someone whose mission is dissuading people from an interest in UFOs. Strange story.
Yeah, we get a lot like that, though. I mean, one of the classic examples, that John mentioned in that article is that the Men in Black just don't seem very familiar with things that to us are just normal, everyday things, like how to eat food. Their clothes seem out of fashion. They seem clumsy. Even when they're interviewing witnesses, it's almost like they're not able to put the words together properly. In other cases, in some cases, they seem to lack energy, or their energy suddenly drops like a diabetic who needs sugar. They almost as if, their energy is just winding down to nothing. So we get a lot of these very strange aspects that we can typically ascribe to the Men in Black. When people say they've been visited by someone and they didn't understand how to hold a cup and saucer and things like that, these are all good indications that we're dealing with the weirder aspect of the Men in Black, if you like.
Let me read you another passage here as well, as it kind of continues. In May of the same year, this is 1967, a figure identifying himself as Major Richard French of the U.S. Air Force entered the restaurant of Miss Ralph Butler in Owatonna, Minnesota. French had an olive complexion and pointed features and dark hair that was much too long for an Air Force officer. Mrs. Butler thought. He was dressed in civilian clothes that seemed brand new. Butler saw the soles of his shoes, and they were absolutely unscuffed. Otherwise, he appeared unexceptional until he complained about an upset stomach, and Butler brought him some Jell-O. And the story continues, and I know that you talked about this one as well, that he cannot eat the Jell-O properly. He's trying to drink it.
Yeah, yeah. This is quite a famous case. The Jell-O drinking Man in Black. And again, one of the ironic things is that the Men in Black seem to want to silence people, but their activities are so strange that they become memorable. It's almost like that they achieve the aim of silencing the person, but the fact that they acted so strange, the person never forgets it, and that's often why I think sometimes they speak out, because they realize that something strange has happened to them, and eventually they feel the need to tell people. So in that respect, the silencing doesn't always work on a long-term basis, at least.
There's a theory, Nick, that this is done by someone else, if you will. The Men in Black are being used by someone, if you will, and this is to try to destabilize the witness, to discredit the witness. That if you have a sighting, pretty much, of a UFO, and then you have this very, very strange account of a person that even when you as a witness would describe the Men in Black, it's like you would be ridiculed almost for trying to retell a story of this incredible strange behavior. What about that theory? Is that a plausible theory?
Oh yeah, I think that's very possible, and actually I think that is part of the mystery. I think, I don't think the purpose of the Men in Black visiting people is just solely to silence them. I actually think you're right, that part of it is to make the witness look ridiculous, or make them look like a fantasist, because You know, if you have a genuinely strange and significant UFO experience, people, even people who aren't that familiar with the UFO subject, might listen to you, you know, your friends or somebody, your next door neighbor, that sort of thing. But if you start saying the men in black have been knocking on the front door, people might be inclined to think you're crazy or paranoid, etc., etc.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes the men in black visitations are actually done to, in the event that the person decides to speak out, saying that you've seen the men in black will actually lessen the credibility of the witness and the report. And I think that's part of the actual game plan.
There seems to be something in terms of the behavior, unless they are human beings that are told to act in this way, and that maybe they've even have makeup on, for all we know, in terms of the olive complexion and all that. But I mean, it could be that we're talking about a kind of a very advanced but yet not really well programmed robot of sorts. There's been reports that they very much look the same. That would imply that there's some kind of clones almost. And on top of that, of course, Nick, you have the idea that they're some kind of genetic experiment or a hybrid of sorts.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is actually an interesting point because, you know, people talk about hybridization and, you know, hybrids between aliens and humans. And the men in black do seem to sort of straddle the human side of things and the alien side. You know, as I said, they don't look like the typical alien grey, you know, that we know from ufology, but they don't look exactly like us. They seem to exist somewhere between the two. They have you know, they look skinny, they have the pale skin, larger eyes, and smaller sized bodies, 5 foot to 5 feet tall, 5'5", something along those lines. And in a number of cases, as bizarre as it sounds, you're quite right, they have been reported wearing what looks like makeup to try and darken their skin, and even badly fitting wigs suggesting they don't even have hair. So, you know, if you imagine them with these widely set eyes that they hide behind sunglasses, with widely set eyes, bulging eyes, white skin, no hair whatsoever on the body or face, you know, not even telltale stubble, you know, from shaving, nothing like that at all. In other words, you could actually paint a picture where they do seem very alien-like. And you're also right when you say they're kind of robotic. One of the words that a number of witnesses have used is zombie-like, in the sense that they seem almost to sort of shuffle along and so almost only vaguely aware of their own existence or their own role and job. It's almost as if, rather than being totally self-aware, functioning beings, it's almost as if they're created, you know, they're almost like a computer program, but that's sent into the real world to do a job, and then when it's completed its job, the program shut down until it's needed again. That they literally come across like that, as if they've been sort of manifested to perform a particular task. And even they don't seem to be fully self-aware, other than this is what they have to do, and then when it's over, they leave and they're gone. So everything about them really sort of screams, you know, alien or robotic or zombie-like.
What about the time travel idea or theory? These accounts that they are basically vanishing sometimes, maybe not directly in front of somebody's eyes, but as you alluded to earlier, they turn around the bend of a building and then they're gone. Or in some cases, we hear stories about there's no trace of transportation. They might be visiting a house far out onto the countryside, and they close the door, and when the witness, if you will, looks out the window, they're gone, and there's no car there either.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, this particular theory is sort of one of the most fascinating ones, and the time travel angle. And I interviewed a man named Joshua P. Warren quite extensively about this, because Josh has been looking into this particular theory for the Men in Black, the idea that they could be, rather than being aliens or something paranormal, they're actually time travelers from our distant future. Now, one of the reasons why this theory is so intriguing is that in most of the Men in Black cases on record, although they wear the black suits and the hats and the ties, they're always in a very old-fashioned style, sort of 1940s, 1950s style, you know, that you would see in like an old 1950s Hollywood gangster movie, something like that. You know, that they have the fedora-type hats, as they call them, the skinny black ties, and they even drive old-fashioned 1950s, 1960s type cars with like the shark fin tails and white wheels, that sort of thing, but just totally black cars. And so, in other words, everything about the Men in Black, from the cars they drive to their style of clothing, is all out of date and all out of time. And Josh wondered, if you're a time traveler from the future, maybe something's happened in the future. Granted, this is speculation, but maybe something's happened in the future where the people of that era don't have a full history of what happened in the 20th and 21st centuries. And so they're forced to kind of guess with the fashions that are in fashion, in the 50s, 60s, or the 70s, and sometimes they make mistakes. And Josh also made a good point, the fact that if you are a time traveler and, you're coming back to 2011, and then the next hour you're in 2010, 2001, then back to 1941, up to 1958, then 1967, then back to 1939, the black suit, tie, and hat probably is one costume or outfit that you could wear throughout those entire decades,
right,
and not really be noticed too much. In other words, you couldn't go back to 1910 and wear a Nirvana T-shirt and combat boots, because if somebody took a photograph and found it today, your cover would be blown.
Yeah.
But probably from 1910 to 2011, you could wear a black suit and not be noticed anywhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, see, that makes sense. And that would imply, obviously, also that they're specifically interested in possibly a certain time frame here then, because, again, that would just entail them to, pretty much travel within, as you said, from 1910 pretty much up to, well, they can still be here up to today, but today it's being reported, that they're kind of outdated clothes-wise and so forth. Yeah. Could it be, is it something around this time period that they would be interested in? Any theories, Nick?
I mean, it could be, yeah. I mean, for example, we get Men in Black reports turn up not just in UFO activity. For example, the famous Mothman sightings at Point Pleasant, West Virginia, in the 1960s that John Keel wrote about in his book, The Mothman Prophecies. The Men in Black turned up there. Now, you could speculate that, if the Men in Black are time travelers, they might want to come back and, turn up and try and figure out some old unsolved mysteries. So they turn up, maybe they're not connected with Mothman. Maybe they were coming back, as a history project or something to try and determine what Mothman was. I mean, Another example, there were a lot of Men in Black type figures. Now, granted, some of them could have been government people, but a lot of Men in Black type figures were reported around Dealey Plaza when President Kennedy was shot. Now, you could argue that that was one of the most sort of historic events of the 20th century, which is still shrouded in controversy and mystery. So if you're a future historian and you want to really find out who killed Kennedy, you come back to 1963 and hang around, the grassy knoll trying to find out. So maybe that's what some of these Men in Black were. They're literally like historians trying to solve the Kennedy assassination. Observers,
they're trying to piece together the truth of certain matters in history, perhaps. Yeah. It could even mean that there actually are agents of future humans, actually, in that one sense. Then, but the only one who can be sent back in time would be kind of a biological robot or some kind of clone,
Yeah, it could be, and I mean, again, we're talking obviously about speculative things, but sure. I mean, it may well be the case that, to cope with the rigors and the traumas of time travel, we may need to be sort of biologically altered. It's kind of like with space travel, even with our astronauts now, the relatively short times they spend in space, when they come back to Earth, if they've been up there for months, they have trouble walking for a while because their muscles have gone weak.
That's right.
So in other words, if we're experiencing that sort of thing with space travel today, you could argue that if in the future we could be genetically altered to cope with the rigors of space travel, maybe something similar needs to be applied with respect to time travel. And maybe, the weirder Men in Black, the reason they look strange is because they literally have been biologically altered to survive, whatever the traumas are that are associated with time travel.
I heard a story about Oswald, Lee Harvey Oswald, who, the alleged shooter of JFK, and that he reported, or maybe it was someone who witnessed this, but there was some kind of encounter with Men in Black as well. He was taking care of a few Men in Black. Have you heard that story?
Yeah, there's a few actually there's a couple of stories about Oswald that actually tie in with the Men in Black mystery. One is that he actually did sort of hang around, particularly when he was in the New Orleans area, with sort of shadowy guys in black suits, and they would meet up, etc. They would be seen in cafes and restaurants, and I think in retrospect, some of those probably were intelligence guys. I'm pretty sure of that.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, there have been people who've said that they saw Oswald in one location, where other people said they clearly saw him in another place at the exact same time. And one of the interesting things about the Men in Black is that there are a number of cases on record where they've actually impersonated someone, and somebody is sure that they've seen, so for example, this happened with John Keel, where somebody said that they'd been threatened by Keel, and when they saw a picture of him, they said, that was the guy who threatened me, and he had a black suit on. But Keel could prove he wasn't even in the area at that time. And this has happened with people like Gray Barker also, where, it was almost like a doppelganger appeared, but dressed as a man in black. And so, we have this parallel with Oswald as well, where, there have been literally like numerous Oswald reported, like in Dallas, in New Orleans, and in Mexico, when, it clearly couldn't have been the same person running around in such a short time period.
There's another interesting portrayal, and this comes up in modern fiction as well. There's a movie called Dark City. There you have kind of administrators of this kind of experiment. They're messing around with people and trying to study their behavior. Basically, they have pale skin, they talk strange, and it's very much the Men in Black scenario right there. Yeah,
actually, Dark City is a very good film, and if you look at the Men in Black in that movie, that's pretty much how the real Men in Black look. They don't look like sort of Will Smith or Tommy Lee Jones. They probably the best portrayal of a Man in Black is Richard O'Brien's portrayal in Dark City, where he looks sinister and skinny and weird, and they come out at night in groups of 3 or 4, and they kind of hide in the shadows and menace people. And but you're right that in the movie they come across as they're sort of manipulators of the people in this constructed city. They don't realize it's actually like a created gigantic spacecraft in many respects, like a created world. They don't even realize they're not on Earth. But the central premise is that these sort of Men in Black are sort of caretakers, if you like, who manipulate the people. And I think there's a good argument to be said that that's what the Men in Black in reality seem to do. They turn up and manipulate people, and we kind of have this idea that they're sort of manipulating things behind the scenes for a bigger picture that we're not really seeing properly yet.
Absolutely. I don't know if you ever watched the fairly new television series over in the States called Fringe, and they kind of show this pretty much accurately as well. Very interesting, weird. They even actually in there have this account of one of them sitting down and eating this whole sandwich without even chewing it, basically.
Yeah, they've obviously. Yeah, I remember when that first surfaced over here in the US. They obviously were very, inspired by the real life Men in Black reports by the guys, they have in the film. In the TV series. They look very Men in Black like, and they did a sort of a good job of applying the Men in Black mystery, to the Fringe scenario.
Absolutely. Why don't we talk a little bit more here? I want to discuss the occult aspects to this as well. The influences, if you will, of the occult. If we go back again to the originator, and remind me again, Nick, if we're talking about, was it Bender or was it Baker that was into the occult here?
Well, actually, it was both of them.
Both of them. So, okay, there you go.
Bender was the guy who really began the Men in Black mystery, if you like, in history. And as I said, Bender was heavily into things like occultism, Ouija boards, ghosts, paranormal phenomena in the real world. But he's also a big fan of things like Edgar Allan Poe, Bram Stoker, H.P. Lovecraft particularly. And he was someone who developed a fascination, for both fact and fiction when it came to the paranormal. Now, when we talk about the occult angle, or, if Bender was just sort of a one-off person who, said that he happened to have an interest in UFOs and the paranormal, we could say, well, so what? It's not that significant. But one of the things I found doing the research, and I specifically referred to this quite extensively in the book, is a number of people who'd had Men in Black experiences had actually been dabbling with Ouija boards beforehand. And, they've been kind of trying to contact, dead relatives or whoever, and had opened a doorway or a portal to something at least, which potentially allowed these Men in Black, or at least one category of these Men in Black, into our realm of existence, whether it's a portal or a doorway to another dimension or some supernatural realm, who knows. But the very fact that a number of witnesses were dabbling and using Ouija boards prior to the experiences is significant, because reports along these lines have surfaced, from wildly different countries. And on top of that, a number of people who had MIB experiences in the days afterwards and immediate days and weeks afterwards, several people reported quite violent poltergeist activity in the house. Now, of course, there's no real way to reconcile that with, somebody turning up from the CIA. That goes far beyond anything really, in my mind at least, that the government could be involved in. So, again, we seem to have a paranormal category to the Men in Black, or a supernatural category. The problem is, of course, people use the terms like paranormal and supernatural really without an understanding of what the phenomena might be. And that's the biggest problem we face, is not the fact that they may be strange and exhibit strange phenomena and may be tied in with Ouija boards, but why that is. I don't think it's as simplistic as, they're coming out of hell or whatever.
Sure,
that's more like, to me, the terms heaven and hell are more, I guess, sort of, a lot of people probably won't like it when I say this, but they're kind of like control factors.
It's true.
They put fear in people, and the fear of going to hell, or the guilt if you do this, you're going to burn in hell. It's almost like a controlling metaphor, but it doesn't mean there might not be a form of life after death or a supernatural realm. But I think the important thing is we take it out of the simplistic belief systems that have developed, throughout worldwide religions. But it still means, to me at least, I think that there's some sort of paranormal realm where the MIB seem to be coming from.
It's interesting, because obviously that has to do with the kind of a theological perspective as well. We put the intentions behind that, if it's good or bad or evil or what have you. But I found another interesting bridging gap, if you will, between this. If we look at the world of sci-fi again, there was a Christian writer, I think he was raised Roman Catholic, and he wrote the book that later became the movie Knowing. And in there, you also have these very, very interesting Men in Black type figures, which I don't want to spoil it for anybody, so turn it off for a few seconds here. But the angels you see at the end there, if you will, there's a correlation there, that the MIB in that case is kind of like the angelic force that you can allude to in the Bible, right, Nick?
Yeah, and I think one of the things about the Men in Black that a lot of people probably only think of when it's brought up, subconsciously. If these guys turn up in black suits, black ties, and hats, etc., and they look stern, our immediate reaction is to think, they're not the friendliest guys around, and they're our enemy.
Yeah.
The ironic thing is, as some people have suggested, maybe the MIB are almost, as Joshua P. Warren said, Josh wondered if they're time travelers, that they could be kind of time cops, preserving timelines and preventing time paradoxes from occurring. In other words, they look menacing and they might terrorize people, but if it's for the greater good, they might actually be the good guys. But we just don't realize it or see it, because we sort of, that image of the stern white face and the sunglasses and the hat and the suit, it kind of portrays this sort of 1950s FBI look combined with, the mafia. So people feel intimidated. But maybe that's just our subconscious perceptions that we assume the worst because they look the worst. So.
Well, that's interesting because obviously the early 1900s and up to now or 50s and 60s, you have a world which is rapidly changing with the industrial era. We have world wars around that. We have atomic explosions and nuclear technologies and everything. It could be that they're trying to map things or keep it in order, or maybe actually even correcting something for all we know.
Yeah, and again, I think the biggest problem of all is because we only have sort of fragmentary stories of the Men in Black. We've never actually physically captured one, and we just have the witness reports as good evidence. Bigger problem is the fact that we're only seeing, I think, one part of the picture, and I think that part of the picture that we're seeing, is certainly a sinister one. But on the other hand, because it's such a fragmentary story, that we're forced to fill in the gaps, if you like, as to what we think's going on, and we may actually be filling the gaps in incorrectly. As I said, they look sinister, they sound sinister, so the tendency is to think the MIB are the bad guys of ufology. Maybe they're just trying to work out what's going on, and they're from some other realm. Maybe they're like the human race. We're neither good nor bad. We all have different sides to our characters, and maybe one particular type of MIB are involved in this particular issue, another branch of the MIB are involved in this. It could be kind of like branches of government or tiers of government, if you like.
Interesting. One thing that you're alluding to, obviously, is that more data is needed, and there's more of this that we haven't talked about yet. I want to continue to talk more with you about here, Nick, in the next segment. So why don't we take a little short break here in between the segments here. But let's talk a little bit about your website. And obviously, again here, we want to reference people to, of course, the book. That is what we're talking about here. Your website is nickredfern.com. And then the full title of the book is The Real Men in Black, Evidence, Famous Cases, and True Stories of These Mysterious Men and Their Connection to the UFO phenomena. And Nick, can people find more information on the website, or where would you like to direct people?
Do what was good for him, and he wanted to stay healthy and alive. He would leave the UFO subject and walk away, which is exactly what he did. And this really sort of gave birth to the Men in Black mystery and the legend. And from there, what happened is that Gray Barker, who was a friend of Albert Bender and also a fellow UFO researcher, who was a very good author also, a very sort of imaginative author who could, he could tell a non-fiction story, but he had a very imaginative way of doing it. And he related Bender's experiences in a 1956 book called They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers. And this reinforced the scenario of the Men in Black going around, very often in groups of three, and silencing people. So really, between the two of them, Bender and Barker were the two guys who really kind of kicked off the entire Men in Black mystery.
Absolutely. It's very interesting, their story and the connection and things that have happened since that time, obviously. But why don't we talk a little bit about, I guess, run through some of the theories about what or who they are. There is, as far as I understand it as well, Nick, references to the fact that these, beings, people, what have you, have been around, further back into history as well. I remember actually listening to a presentation by John Keel, who brought some attention to this topic as well, about them being connected with the Sami people of the north, or the Lapland.
Yeah, we live just outside Dallas, and I think it's about 103, 104 right now. So, and it's even at night, it's not getting down below about 90, 91. So.
Wow. And any rain at all, or is it still very dry?
Oh, no. Rain's about as rare as a UFO right now.
Well, there you go. Is it rare with UFO sightings down in Texas?
Well, actually, I think probably UFO sightings aren't as rare as rain right now. So,
have you ever, Nick, been to the Marfa area? Look at the Marfa lights in Texas.
I actually haven't, but there's a lot of people don't realize there's a lot of areas around Texas that have sightings of these ghostly lights like the Marfa lights. And I've investigated a number of them, but Marfa's quite a long way south of here, but it's on the list, put it that way. So.
Yep, absolutely. Are you familiar with any bases a la S4 Area 51 style down there?
Well, there's a lot of military bases. Fort Hood, for example, is a military base in Texas, which has had a number of ties to the UFO subject, where people have come forward talking about sort of like classified UFO research undertaken from the base. And back in the late 1970s, a UFO researcher named Leonard Stringfield published a lot of material about UFO activity involving the military at Fort Hood. So there's quite a bit of stuff, going on along those lines in Texas as well.
Absolutely. I recall.
Port in Connecticut, USA. And even back to his teens, he had an interest in paranormal phenomena and sort of horror phenomena, both in the world of fiction and fact. He actually developed a big interest in things like the Bermuda Triangle and UFOs in the post-World War era, in the post-Second World War era. But he was also very interested in the writings of people like H.P. Lovecraft and Edgar Allan Poe. So he was someone who, sort of straddled fiction and fact when it came to having an interest in paranormal phenomena. And in 1952, Bender set up an organization called the International Flying Saucer Bureau. And the idea was to basically put a group together in the United States which would have a network of contacts. And the group actually took off far bigger, I think, than on a much larger scale than Bender probably anticipated. And chapters of the group were set up in England and Australia and elsewhere. And it really became a large-scale organization. And this was made all the more mysterious by the fact that barely a year after Bender established the group, when it was doing really well and it was very successful, he closed the group down. He completely shut it down without warning and alluded to two of his friends, that he'd been visited by 3 men in black. And they'd essentially told him if he knew. But a lot of people don't realize that the movies were based on a comic book series of the same name, which were inspired by real-life encounters with Men in Black-style characters. Now, as I said, a lot of people just assume that they're creations of Hollywood. So one of the things I wanted to do was to set the record straight and demonstrate to people that the Men in Black phenomenon is a very real one. And also, a lot of people, even within the UFO research community, thought that the Men in Black mystery was a very old one, from the 1940s through the 60s, and then it had kind of vanished or gone away. But the reality is I've been able to find reports right up until the present day, literally like 2009, 2010. So that was the other reason to write the book, was to demonstrate this is very much an ongoing mystery. And so the fact that I've been able to uncover a lot of new cases as well was one of the reasons why I felt that the time was sort of right to put out a new full-length study of the Men in Black mystery.
Absolutely. I think there's 2 men that seems to be kind of at the root of the phenomena, at least in the beginning of describing it and making it kind of known, I guess. Albert K. Bender and Gray Barker. Talk a little bit about that, Nick.
Yeah, sure. Well, Albert Bender was probably the one person more than anybody else who was responsible for kicking off, if you like, and beginning the Men in Black mystery. Now, Bender grew up in a place called Bridge.
Well, there was a very interesting, it wasn't really a sighting of sorts, but it was some kind of weird light phenomena in Fort Worth in Texas. I don't know if you recall that. It was from May earlier this year, Nick.
I don't recall that one offhand, but there have been a lot of reports over the course of about the last year or so that I can think of, probably 20 or 30 reports that I've received of just weird things in the sky, that don't necessarily fit the image of like a classic UFO or flying saucer, but just weird aerial phenomena, strange flashes of lights, like explosion type noises in the sky, that actually sound like they are coming from the sky rather than the ground. So, Texas is kind of a weird state where we get a lot of strange UFO activity going on.
Absolutely, and of course we're here primarily today, Nick, to talk about strange things on the surface of the Earth, about your book, The Real Men in Black, a really interesting subject that I don't think we've specifically, directly talked with anybody about before. So this is going to be really exciting. Maybe you can just set the tone a little bit for us, Nick, and just tell us about the outline of the book, if you will, the main theme that you're running through.
Yeah, sure. Well, basically, I'm sure most people who, when they think of the Men in Black, they naturally think of the Hollywood movies starring Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones. And the movies, they're interesting, fun-packed adventures.